Us Sacramento Kings fans, we've been through the ringer, right? Nearly 2 decades of losing. And in the midst of that, there was a near relocation. So, keeping all of that in mind, the Sacramento standards may look at the last 2 winning seasons for the Kings, despite missing the playoffs last year, and go, you know what? This is good enough for us. It's fun. Light the beam. We're having a good time. But NBA standards are very, very different. And I promise you, the Sacramento Kings themselves are more interested in living up to NBA standards than they are accepting Sacramento standards. Kyle Madson and I will break that all down, make it make more sense for you. Plus, the incorporation of DeMar DeRozan, and we are just over a week away from the start of training camp. You are listening to Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all offseason long. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor and reporter for ABC 10 News. And one of my good friends here in the media industry, one of my good friends here in Sacramento is ESPN 1320 radio host Kyle Madson. He's back with me here on Locked On Kings. Like I said there during the introduction, it's a bit of a convoluted conversation, but we look at Sacramento standards and what Kings fans are okay or aren't okay with based off of their history in the context of everything we've gone through in recent years, compared to NBA standards, which is none of that matters. The Kings need to win this amount of games or need to win this amount of playoff series or need to compete for a title in order to be considered successful. We're going to balance the two and talk about what ultimately matters more to the Kings themselves. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with ESPN 1320's Kyle Madson. It's a pleasure, as always, to have Kyle Madson join me here on the Locked On Kings podcast. Now, normally I invite a guest in and I have an idea of what we're going to talk about, but Kyle Madson, being the excellent radio host and producer that he is, just did my job for me. Kyle, you actually posed a question about the Sacramento Kings and how the Kings are to be judged that I think is really interesting. And I know going into this is going to strike a chord with me because of the Sacramento bias that I bring into the conversation. But I think it's a really, really important question to ask, considering where the Sacramento Kings are trying to go. So let it fly.
So here's where, and I feel uniquely qualified to bring this up because while I am not a fan of the Sacramento Kings in like the traditional like fanatic standpoint, like I like to see them do well. I like Kings fans. I like Sacramento a lot. I don't view them through the lens necessarily of like just happy to be here in the over 500 category. I'm viewing them from the sense of somebody who's been doing media in Sacramento for like 10 of the last 13 years or however many it is. At some point here, I wonder when the pendulum is going to swing. And I think it's starting to a little bit where they win 48 games 2 years ago. Now, the number 3 seed and they make the playoffs, and it was incredible. It was so much fun. Last year, they win 46. They missed the postseason. But so much of the sentiment that I get from people, and maybe I'm off base on this, but so much of the sentiment I get from people is, well, they've won 94 games the last 2 years. They won. I mean, they were over 500, and compared to what I'd be the 9 seed, and that's so much better than not being like, I get that to an extent, and I understand it, I guess, last year. But at some point, that can't be the standard anymore. And like I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here because I know there are Kings fans who are furious with how last year went. But I feel like that sentiment is largely still the happy to be here kind of vibe. And I just look at this team and I look at what the Kings are roster wise. I think Mike Brown's a great coach. You have 2 All-NBA guys or should be All-NBA guys with Sabonis and Fox. You bring in DeMar DeRozan. I think Keegan Murray is going to be a good player. So, or is a good player. I like what Keon Ellis brought last year. Like there's so many reasons that this team should be really good that I'm going into this year. And I feel like a crazy person because I'm going into this year going, hey man, if they don't win like 50 games with this roster, barring injury or something weird happening, that can throw things off. That changes expectation. But going into the year, the expectation for me is like, yo, if this team isn't winning 50 games, I've got questions depending on how things shake out. I can't imagine a scenario where I'm sitting here at the end of the year and they've won 48 games and I'm like, yeah, that was great. I have higher expectations for them. And I kind of wonder if I'm the outlier or if that's kind of where Kings fans are landing to.
When you first texted me about this question, this talking point, I immediately knew we could do a whole podcast on this. And initially my first response was going to be, okay, I'll talk about like my perspective as someone who went through the near 2 decades of playoff-less basketball. And that was fun during the dawning of the beam season 2 seasons ago. But the conclusion that I kind of came to, Kyle, even though we'll get into how I think Kings fans do use the like Sacramento's history as a crutch in arguments, I think what's most important is that the Kings themselves fundamentally reject the idea that their history has anything to do with consolation prizes. So like even when they were like the season of the beam, the season when they made the playoffs, the amount of times that Mike Brown and Kevin Huerter and these guys who were brand new to Sacramento were asked about the playoff drought and how all of them just kind of said, like, I wasn't here for any of it. Like, I don't care. Yeah. And then De'Aaron Fox and Harrison Barnes were asked about it too, the 2 longest tenured Kings at the time. And they basically, the way they answered is, this team is different. The history or the past has nothing to do with this roster. Essentially, Kyle, like the Kings fundamentally reject any kind of idea of, if they are eliminated in the first round of the playoffs, or like you said, they don't win 50 games, which I think is the measuring stick for this team this year, or God forbid they miss the playoffs again. But let's say like last season, they have a winning record, but they miss the playoffs again. There's not a single person in the locker room, in the organization, top to bottom, from front office, even ownership down, that's like, okay, but because we sucked for so long, at least we had fun, right? That's just a rejected idea in that building.
Yeah. Yeah,
but I think for me, I'll just jump in really quick. For me, like I know I use it as a crutch because when I read and respond to people online that are either fans or primary follow, like national media accounts, for example, that primarily follow a team like the Los Angeles Lakers that don't know about struggle more than 2 or 3 seasons at a time before they can just retool and attract LeBron James and Anthony Davis, or other of these primary markets like that. When they bring up Sacramento's like success and question whether or not it's realistic or not, or when the Kings fall short and people try and bag on or jump on the Kings, I know my defensiveness is look where the Kings came from and look where they are now. But in reality, like you talked about, the addition of DeMar DeRozan to this team, but even before DeMar DeRozan, like last season was unacceptable. The Kings taking a step back and missing the playoffs after making the playoffs the year before and having basically the same exact roster. Last season was unacceptable. That's how the Kings view it. So that's how Kings fans should view it, in my opinion.
Sure. And that's a little bit too, because I being here and being around it, I definitely feel what you're saying. Like when I see a person in the national media or somebody who covers the Hawks, when I see them say something about the Kings that just writes them off or is like disrespectful or selling them short in some way, I get this like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. So I definitely understand that. But at the same time, it's really hard to blame. I'm going to stick with the Hawks because they're the team that like I feel about the Hawks how probably a lot of people on the East Coast feel about the Kings.
That's fair.
Where it's like, yeah, okay, I get it, but I don't follow in my brain, I have a thought about the Hawks where I'm sure the Locked On Hawks host would just tear me apart with my Hawks opinions. And so that's what I try and Hawked On would be, although that's crazy. You can't say that. Never mind.
There's an easy segment there.
No. So anyways, So I definitely get that and what you're saying, but at the same time, it's hard to blame somebody who looks at the Kings and go, okay, so let's whittle this down to like the base element of what the last 2 years have been from a outsider's perspective. First round exit, missed the playoffs. And we who are here, you even more than me, look at the minutia and look at the small things that this team has done and the big things like bringing in DeMar DeRozan and go, all right, hey, there's a team on the rise. This is a team that's ascending. This is a team that found out what Keon Ellis was last year. This is a team that still has Kevin Huerter, who he may be able to make a bigger impact this year. We know that Keegan Murray is an ascending player. Like there's all these things that we know that other people don't. But at the same time, I don't think that I'm talking in circles now. I have a hard time pushing back when somebody's like, well, yeah, I'm not picking the Kings to make the playoffs because they made it once and then they missed the playoffs last year. Like that's a descending team. And I don't get it, but I get it, if that makes sense. Like I get from an outsider's perspective, but at the same time, I guess I'm going off on a different tangent now. Sorry, I'm ruining your podcast.
I don't care. Just let it fly.
Here's where I'm trying to get as I get out of my tangent. You said 50 wins has to be like the baseline this year, and I totally agree. And I just hope that that's where you said like the Kings during that season a couple years ago where they made the playoffs. They all said like this isn't like the goal isn't just to make the playoffs. Like that's step one. But then there's another hoop to jump through. There's another level to get to. And I'm wondering if that's where the fan base is now too, because it's all right, 2 years of really competitive basketball. And now you're going into a third year where you've added DeMar DeRozan. You kept every key piece on the right. I haven't even mentioned Malik Monk. Geez, you've kept every big piece. You've re-signed Malik Monk. I'm going into this year with expectations for the Kings higher than I've ever had for them. And I wonder if fans are following suit.
Like I said at the top of the show, today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, I know this is an NBA and Kings podcast, but right now, NFL football is carrying us through. And NFL fans, you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game and feel like a game's going in one way or another, you have an idea how the game's going to end, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page that you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Put $5 on anything at all. And whether you win or you lose, you're guaranteed to get $200 worth of bonus bets for you to really start to make some money on FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Are NBA standards universal? And what I mean by that is like the ultimate goal for every NBA team is to be a champion and win a championship. But like, by NBA standards, should the Sacramento Kings and LA Lakers, the Sacramento Kings and the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Sacramento Kings and the defending champion Boston Celtics, should they all be held to the same standard in the NBA's eyes of success for Sacramento and success for Boston are essentially the same thing, which is winning a title? Or in the NBA's eyes, can the Sacramento Kings have a great season by making it to the playoffs, winning a round, and then being eliminated? Or is that still not good enough in the NBA's eyes?
No, I think it's not necessarily by team like historically. But I do think that there are differing levels of success, right? For the Boston Celtics, anything short of a championship is going to be like, what happened?
Right.
The Denver Nuggets did not have a successful year last year. Oklahoma City did, I think, by their standard. So I don't think it's universal. Like every team, it's if you don't win a championship, you're a failure. Because if the San Antonio Spurs make the playoffs this year, it's like, holy crap, they just made, what a season.
Right.
Whereas if the Celtics make the playoffs, it's not a big deal. Like that's
sure.
it. So I do think there are there are like different tiers that teams fall into where the standard is set by that tier. There's like your championship contenders where it's championship or bust. And then you're like ascending contenders where, okay, pencil them in for the playoffs, but man, they need to win a round of maybe 2. And I think the Kings fall into a tier below that where you got to make the playoffs. And then I think we saw this year in the West that so many things are matchup based. Like, I don't think they will, but let's say the Pelicans just give the Kings fits again, and the Kings just happen to run into them in the first round, and they lose in the first round. It's like, all right, bad matchup, stuff happens.
Right.
But for me, the Kings fall firmly into the tier of, hey, if they're not in the playoffs, and frankly, for me, I get if somebody wants to push back against this. For me, it's top 6. I think if you're in the play-in, that means you're winning. What were the top 48? I think
48 games. Yeah.
I mean, that means you're winning about the same amount of games that you have the last 2 years. And okay, maybe you win your play-in game and you make the postseason as a 7 or 8 seed. That doesn't.
I'm with you.
But at the same time, and this is, I'm now arguing with myself, but at the same time, Matt, if let's say they are the 7 seed and they lose their first playing game, win the second one, so they're the 8 seed going in, and then they win in the first round. Like, that's not, nobody's going like, yeah, but they didn't make the real playoffs.
Right.
You know? So
yeah.
I think that they fall firmly into the standard of you got to make the postseason. And for me, if you're the 6 seed and you lose to the 3 seed in the first round, like, okay, like that happens. But if you're sneaking into the playoffs as an 8 seed because you had to win or go home play-in game, and then you lose in the first round, it'd be really hard to be like, hey, at least they made the playoffs. At least not for me.
Right. I've just come to the realization, and I think a lot of Sacramento Kings fans are the same way. And I've come to this realization multiple times, by the way. It's not like an epiphany. Yeah. Sacramento Kings fans and myself, we care a hell of a lot more about the national perception of the Kings than the Kings do themselves.
Definitely.
And when And what I mean, but like when I think about that or dissect that or go a layer further, I think like, what do the Sacramento Kings have to do to being universally respected or universally praised doesn't exist, right? You can be a fun team. Like the closest thing I feel like you can get to that is either winning a championship outright. And even then people are still going to hate on you. Like look at the Boston Celtics. They are the easiest path. Or you could, like the Kings did what they did 2 years ago, where they come out of nowhere and are this fun story. And everybody says they're my favorite league pass team to watch. Like that's the closest I feel you can get to like universally being appreciated or liked. And even then that has its limits.
Right.
But I'm wondering if we're talking like NBA standards of what we think the baseline, like in Sacramento, the baseline expectations of success or failure, it feels like we're setting it and the Kings themselves are setting it at that 50 win threshold. Because if you pass 50 wins, in the West, you absolutely should be a playoff team. And then at that point, it becomes, okay, what can you do in the postseason for the second time? But by the NBA standards, if Sacramento's a 50-win team, does the NBA in general, the universal mouth of the NBA, whoever the hell it is, do they say that the Sacramento Kings are a good to great basketball team by that standard alone? Or does it have to be more than that?
Ooh. Here's the deal. The Kings aren't going to be the story in the West unless they win 58 games and they're the 1 seed.
For sure.
But Oklahoma City has that mantle right now.
Yep.
Minnesota is up there. Anthony Edwards is going to get a ton of love all year long.
Yep.
Dallas, with what they did last year, going to the finals, they're going to be in the discussion. We know the Lakers and Warriors are always going to get billing above a team like Sacramento. So from that standpoint, if they win 50 and are the 5 seed, I don't think it's the national perspective is not going to probably be what Sacramento wants it to be. Because if they win 50 and they're the 5 seed, we're like, yo, it's working. The next step has been taken. Like they're in a 4-5 matchup in the playoffs. They can definitely win this. Let's go. They're cooking. Vibes are great here. But that's kind of where this discussion kind of hits for me, because while we can say that and we can be like, yeah, hell yeah, like winning 50 is nice, but then it's okay, what do you do in the postseason? And I think that's what people would be watching for with Sacramento, to really give them the flowers that I think that we here in Sacramento want to see them get. Is, all right, you got to go win a playoff series now. Because winning 50 is cool. Like, that's a nice number to get to. Not a ton of teams win 50 games every year, no doubt. And from the Sacramento standpoint, that'd be a nice accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not going to be the thing where all of a sudden they're leading Get Up because the Kings won 50 games. Like, people aren't going to care.
Sure.
And that's where I think it might be frustrating this year, because the Kings, I think, are going to be pretty good. And I think they'll get some shine. You know, Mike Wilbon, Kendrick Perkins. I know they've been on Sacramento. I think that'll be there. And honestly, I think a guy like Austin Rivers is a pretty smart basketball mind. He talks a bit about the Kings on his podcast and always does so with a healthy respect. So I could see them getting like a, hey, don't rule out the Kings. Don't forget about the Kings. But from the like, oh, this is a contender, you got to do way more than win 50. Mm. And that's kind of where I think this discussion hits for me, because I understand, as somebody here in Sacramento, in the media here with a ton of friends who are Kings fans, I understand why winning 50 games, and I'm going to keep saying the 5 seed, and being the 5 seed would be like,
right.
Oh my
God. Get a parade going, right?
Right. But at the same time, I also understand, as a person who doesn't have like that the deep emotional investment that like you and listeners and people that fill up Golden One Center do. I also understand, like, in the grand scheme, that's not like, you're not writing books about that team.
Sure.
And that's where, and that's kind of, I guess, where this discussion landed for me, because I do think that's two very separate things.
This episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for, whether you're into speed, power, or style. eBay Motors has got you covered, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home some huge wins. eBay Guaranteed Fit is amazing. Your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. I guess we'll throw the question out to the listeners too, and you can respond on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, or hit either of us up on Twitter. You can see our Twitters there at the bottom, at Matt George Sack, at Kyle A. Madson.
Unless you disagree with me, then don't hit me up. I haven't tried.
Then just tell me that you disagree with Kyle. I guess my question to Kings fans is, from the Sacramento perspective, what line of the Kings not getting the ultimate job done, which is winning a championship, what line or tier of falling short is acceptable to you, right? If the Kings make it back to the playoffs and lose in the first round again, is that acceptable to you because they made it back into the playoffs? Or do they have to win a playoff series for you to then feel good? And there's some people that say, okay, you won a playoff series, but you still had 2 other series to win before even sniffing the NBA finals, right? So that's just step 1 out of 4. So some people might have even higher expectations than that if the ultimate goal is to win a championship. So I'm curious their response to that. But Kyle, I'm also curious to your response to this, and it's shifting gears a little bit. I shared earlier in the offseason that I feel, for the Sacramento Kings, the most important part of this season is having a clear answer to this question. Do I feel comfortable and confident going all in with this group? That is the question that I think Monty McNair has to have a definitive answer to, either at the trade deadline or next offseason. Because at that point, you're looking at a massive payday for De'Aaron Fox, Keegan Murray's contract coming up, and only a year or 2 left of DeMar DeRozan. And you're paying Domantas Sabonis $40+ million a year. Do you feel confident that this is the group that you say, I will use the rest of my assets to go and get one more piece, and this team can win a title? That, to me, is the most important question that the Kings need to ask. And if the answer is no to that question, I don't know where they go from there.
That's kind of where I'm with you. I'm a naturally pessimistic sports fan. And so that's always every team, the biggest potential panic button is always like in the back of my mind. And that is kind of that's where you're right. That's where the conversation is. And you say packaging up the rest of the assets. And I want to be clear too, what I'm about to say. And this also goes to the expectations thing. Like expectations change throughout the year.
100%.
If the Kings start out 18-2, all of a sudden a first round exit feels like a disaster, right?
Right. 100%.
Right. So that this is about going into the year. So I'll say this, and I say this with the understanding of like what we know today. How this answer changes and how we feel about it can change as the season goes along. But for me, it's Domantas Sabonis, De'Aaron Fox, Keegan Murray, Malik Monk, DeMar DeRozan. Those are the five, right?
It's your core.
And I think this is what you're asking. And this is where this gets hard because obviously those are all beloved players like DeMar DeRozan. That's why Sacramento rocks, because DeMar DeRozan hasn't even worn a Kings jersey yet. And people are like, hell yeah, DeMar DeRozan, one of us. Let's go.
Yeah. MVP, Hall of Fame.
Yeah, right. So here for it. I love it. But what happens if the Kings reach a point where, okay, this core is kind of maximized, and to get the team over the hump, one of those guys got to go. And it sounds insane. And I'm sure that there's people throwing stuff at their computer or their phone right now, like, to hell with that, going to keep them all forever. And that's fine. If that's right, like the move, and maybe they are, I don't believe, based on what we know right now, I don't think that five with the pieces they have is a title team.
I agree. They haven't proven it.
I did right. And again, expectations could change, but for right now, that's what I think. And so to get over that hump, is it, hey, the hump we need to get over means trading Kevin Huerter and a couple of future picks to go get like a 6th or 7th guy? Or is it moving Keegan Murray?
Yep.
Or moving Malik Monk or whatever to go get like an all-star?
To get a star.
And again, I know that people love Malik Monk and love Keegan, and the thought of parting with one of them is brutal. But that's where, to answer your question, I'm not confident that this roster is a title contender. I'm not confident that they will be in 2 or 3 years. And that's why I think it all kind of like lies with Keegan, right? Because I think asking more from Sabonis is insane. Asking more from Fox, it feels like a lot.
Scoring wise, I think you can.
Yeah, I think so too. But it's not like a meteoric leap from De'Aaron Fox, I think.
Sure.
So it's all, to me, a lot of this comes down to Keegan and what does Keegan do?
Correct.
So I maybe Keegan takes a leap and everything's fine, and you can just fill in with the bench and you fill in your depth and everything's cool. But the thing that I have that panic button in the back of my head with the Kings is, hey man, I think the nuclear option at some point is going to need to get hit, and it's going to be moving one of those core guys.
Where you're at is kind of similar to what I've thought about, which is that the road from the Kings right now to becoming a title contender, it's not unbelievably long like you're the Charlotte Hornets or Detroit Pistons.
No.
But it's going off into the distance to where you lose sight of it a little bit. Like it's you still have a ways to go. That being said, the crossroads to try and get there, I think, is this year. And that's what's interesting about this team to me. It's like, that's where I feel that Monty and the Kings have to have, maybe not a definitive, but have to have a really, really good idea of what direction they need to take by the end of this season, by next offseason, if they want to ultimately maximize this group. Because if not, they risk putting themselves in the position that a couple of years ago, when the Kings weren't making the playoffs at all, we would have been fine with, which is, hey, let's be the Portland Trailblazers, perpetual playoff team that never makes it past the second round every single year. I can live with that. But then you actually get into it and everybody in Portland's going, get Dame some help. This is maddening. Why can't we actually win a title? Right? The Kings aren't there yet, but looking into the future financially, even with a new TV deal coming, financially, they're setting themselves up to be there. Because if they want to stick with this core, with 2 out of the 5, like we talked about, Keegan and De'Aaron facing paydays, De'Aaron potentially facing a super max if he makes an all-NBA team, you are priced into what you got. So if you don't feel like that core 5 with the addition of some help around the edges can win you a title, you run the risk of just capping yourself into being a perpetual playoff team that can't get the job done. And while I don't think the Kings need to get too far ahead of themselves and they need to like take it one step at a time and don't try and jump too many rungs up the ladder, Monty McNair in this front office is smart enough to understand and project where they're going and where they're trying to get to and see what's not adding up. That's why I feel like the crossroads is this season, even if this team is still 2 or 3 years away from legitimate title contention. Or maybe they hit the fast forward button this year because DeMar DeRozan's here.
Yeah, which is definitely, and that's why I caveat this with like expectations could definitely change. I'm not betting money either way on this team being, this is the title contending group or they have to make another massive move with one of their stars. I don't know. But I think that you're spot on, not only just financially, but while this team is still relatively young, they're on the like older side of young.
Yeah.
Domas turns 29 in May. De'Aaron turns 27 in December. And while that's still like prime, you're talking about a window that is now 3-4 years wide.
Yeah, you're not entering it.
Yeah, right. So
you're
that's the other reason I think this year's a crossroads is because like, man, you don't have 3-4 years to wait around to see if player X develops or player Y develops or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's now and then you throw DeMar DeRozan in there who's 35, just turned 35. It's kind of like you said, you're in it. Like it's now. And the DeMar DeRozan deal to me was a signal of this is a player that they think can get them into title contention. So, all right, that's where you push your chips in. That's what you're kind of betting on. So, yeah, this is a huge year, not only just for this season, because I think it's going to be a fun year, but it's going to determine what the next 3 or 4 years looks like.
Is there a way that there's a contingency plan to this DeMar DeRozan addition? And what I mean by that is DeMar, with this core, we still look at and go, we would be pretty shocked if they won a title. But if DeMar is here for the next 2 years and DeMar helps this team get back to the playoffs, win a playoff series, and uses kind of his veteran leadership to show both the organization and the players that are here for the long haul what they need to do to actually make a deep playoff run. All the while, he's working with Keegan Murray to help Keegan become a better individual scorer and create his own shot. DeMar leaves, and the Sacramento Kings, the DeMar DeRozan era in Sacramento over the next 3 years is the Kings maybe won a playoff series or 2. I think on the surface, that sounds disappointing. But if that then leads to whoever they replace DeMar with this core being ready to truly strike, that team, it's a terrible, kind of painful example for DeMar, but a la the Raptors moving DeMar for Kawhi Leonard, completely different circumstance because Kawhi is an absolute superstar. But like, I wonder if there's a contingency plan in place to where, let's say in the DeMar era of the Sacramento Kings, the Kings only win a couple of playoff series, but never really truly contend for a title. But by the time DeMar's window has closed here in Sacramento, the Kings feel like Keegan's there, Fox and Sabonis are there, and they replace DeMar with the missing piece to ultimately become a title contending team. That feels convoluted, but maybe that's a contingency plan.
Yeah. Like there's like a trajectory that DeMar sets them on, that he indirectly impacts their title chances over the next 4 or 5 years. Like, yeah, I think I sure. Like I could see that. And again, natural pessimist here. The concern I have is the opposite. The concern I have, and we're getting down a different rabbit hole now, but I would love to see that. I would love to see Keegan Murray take a leap because he got to be with DeMar DeRozan, and De'Aaron Fox becomes a different type of leader. This is going to sound like Spanish to anybody who's not a 49er fan, but Fred Warner plays linebacker for the 49ers and is the best player at his position in the league. And he's always been really good, but he didn't take off as a leader and as a player until the 49ers got Quan Alexander, who's another linebacker. And Quan Alexander, very vocal, very outspoken leader. And then Fred Warner kind of took on that role when Quan Alexander left after a couple of years. If that's the impact that DeMar DeRozan has on Keegan Murray and De'Aaron Fox and just kind of changes the mindset of the Kings, then great. The natural pessimist in me wonders if DeMar DeRozan being here for these 3 years are going to take opportunities away from a guy like Keegan and stun his growth. Like that's kind of where, but there's no proof either way. So I'm not going to, like I said, say definitively one thing or the other is going to happen. But I think there's just to get back to the point. I definitely think when you talk contingency plans, I think that's kind of probably it. I get DeMar DeRozan in here, try and contend now, and then hope to draft off of whatever he provides for the next, 3-4 years after it. Because you still, like I said, the age thing becomes a factor, but it's not like De'Aaron Fox is 35. It's not like Domas is 38 and they got 1 year left. So yeah, maybe that's what it is.
Kyle, we've been speculating about this Kings team all summer long. I don't know about you. It's felt like the longest offseason on the planet. That being said, a week from tomorrow, the Kings open up training camp.
Wow.
This could be a whole segment in itself, but we're going to save it here for the very end and kind of make it just a one question here as we wrap up. If you could be a fly on the wall in training camp, or let's say Mike Brown invited you to watch one full session of training camp and you could sit there and you could take in anything you wanted. Nothing was secret. Everything was out there in front of you. What would you want to see, or what question would you want to have answered most? Or what would you be most eagerly trying to get a good idea of, or a definitive idea of, going into preseason and going into the start of the season?
Ooh.
Because I can give you an example if you want time to think.
I have one.
Go.
It's very front of my mind. I'm just trying to think if I'm missing anything. Yeah. Okay. Here's number 2. I'm going to give you two. The second one, but I won't dive in. I would love to know who's going to start at the shooting guard.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
What's it going to look like? Anyways,
100%.
the thing I would love to watch and be able to just like observe practice. And I know this is not practical, but follow me in this hypothetical. I get to stand there and then just as practice is happening, like I can hit pause and be like, what? Asking questions. Mm-hmm. And this is a question I have because Domantas Sabonis said something really interesting at his youth camp. He said that the Kings are going to have to learn to play around DeMar DeRozan.
Mm-hmm.
And that hit me some type of way. And I'm sure he just meant like, yeah, this is a Hall of Fame type of player, integrating him into the offense. Obviously we're going to make sure he's comfortable in doing what he wants to do. But I also think that you can't completely get out of what the Kings do offensively. And I really want to know what that's going to look like. How do they play around DeMar DeRozan while not completely abandoning their offensive philosophy? That's what I would love to kind of see a workout. And while they're going through stuff, maybe it's a scrimmage, maybe it's not, maybe it's just a walkthrough as they kind of figure things out. But I want to know, because that's kind of the big question, right? DeMar DeRozan fitting in the context of the Kings offense sounds great, but if it means it's DeMar DeRozan show and Domantas Sabonis isn't getting to touch the ball as much at the top of the key and picking defenses apart, if it means fewer opportunities for De'Aaron Fox or Keegan Murray, is the risk reward there, or is the juice going to be worth the squeeze? Those are all questions I have that I would love to ask about during a training camp session while they were working on it.
Yeah, I have this image in my head of like a balance scale, right? And you have on one side over here, you have DeMar DeRozan kind of taking over and being the isolation legend that he is. And then you have the Sacramento Kings offense as we know it or believe it to be from 2 seasons ago. Mm-hmm. Like the Kings offense carries more weight to where I think there's more responsibility on DeMar to fit with Sacramento than there is for Sacramento to incorporate DeMar or build around DeMar. And like the perfect balance is 50-50. The ideal world is DeMar comes in and seamlessly can play the way he loves to play, and the Kings can use that and utilize that while also not completely changing what they do, which ultimately I think is possible, especially with Domantas Sabonis can play with anybody. He'll get you the ball wherever the hell you want it. And we've already seen them working together in LA together. So I don't think there's any risk or concern at all with DeMar coming into Sacramento and changing the way the Kings play fundamentally because I'm DeMar DeRozan, get me the basketball. I'm not necessarily concerned about that, but an episode that I'm going to be doing on Locked on Kings in the near future is going to be like the growing pains of adding DeMar. And I think it's incredibly important for the Kings to get off to a hot start this season, but is there a chance that it's a slow start because they're trying to figure everybody out and incorporate everybody? So I think it's an interesting conversation to have, but you can check out Kyle Madson and James Ham, the insiders, on ESPN 1320 every single day from 10 to noon all season long. They will keep you up to date with everything going on with the Kings. Of course, great 49ers coverage. Kyle does a phenomenal job at the Niners Wire if you're interested in the Niners. Kyle, appreciate you, my man. Thanks for making the time to do this. I'm tired of talking hypotheticals. Let's just get some damn Kings basketball back.
Cannot wait for the season to start, man.